The silence in an airplane cabin is a fragile thing. A low hum of engines and recycled air, holding a temporary truce between strangers. But on United Flight 1776 from JFK to San Francisco, that truce was about to be shattered. It began with a 10-year-old boy named Avery, whose only crime was his boundless excitement for the sky, and a man named Gregory Murphy, whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty. When Murphy looked down at the young black child, his face twisted in disgust as he spat out the words, "People like you don't belong here. You're too poor to fly." The insult hung in the air, thick and poisonous. What Murphy didn't know was that his cruel words had just been logged as a potential federal offense by the quiet, unassuming man sitting in seat 12C. John F. Kennedy International Airport was a cathedral of controlled chaos. Its vaulted ceilings echoed with a symphony of rolling suitcases, garbled announcements, and a dozen different languages clashing in the air. At Gate B42, the passengers for United 1776 to San Francisco were a microcosm of the city itself, a chaotic, impatient, vibrant mix of humanity. Among them near the charging station sat 10-year-old Avery Evans and his grandmother Dorothy. To Avery, the airport wasn't just a building. It was the launching point for dreams. His dark eyes, wide with a potent mix of awe and intelligence, darted everywhere, absorbing every detail. He clutched a worn, leather-bound sketchbook in one hand and a meticulously crafted model of a Boeing 787 Dreamliner in the other. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a pilgrim heading to the promised land, the National Youth Aerospace Challenge in California, where he was a finalist. "See, Grandma, the wing rake on that 727 is more aggressive than on the A350. It helps reduce wingtip vortices, which cuts down on induced drag," Avery explained, pointing a small finger towards the tarmac. Dorothy Evans, a woman whose gentle smile was etched with the fine lines of a life well lived, nodded along, her heart swelling with pride. She had raised her grandson since he was a toddler, fostering his brilliant, insatiable curiosity. This trip was the culmination of years of hard work, Avery's late nights, studying aerodynamics, and her own extra shifts as a nurse to afford the tickets. They weren't wealthy, but they were rich in love and ambition. "You're going to teach all those fancy judges a thing or two, my sweet boy," she said, adjusting the collar on his polo shirt. The tranquility of their private world was abruptly shattered by a loud, grating voice. "Patricia, for God's sake, can you get the lounge attendant on the phone? This public Wi-Fi is atrocious. I can't close a multi-million-dollar deal on a network that's probably being used to watch cat videos." Gregory Murphy stood less than 10 feet away, a man in his late 50s who wore his expensive suit like a suit of armor. His face was a permanent sneer. His silver hair was combed back with aggressive precision, and he held his phone as if it were a scepter. His wife, Patricia, a woman who seemed to be perpetually shrinking in his presence, fumbled with her own phone, her movements flustered and apologetic. Gregory's gaze swept across the gate area, with open contempt, his eyes briefly landing on Avery and Dorothy. He saw a woman in a simple cardigan and a small black boy with a toy plane. His lip curled slightly, a micro-expression of disdain that Dorothy caught immediately. She subtly put a protective arm around Avery's shoulder, pulling him a little closer. She had navigated a world full of Gregory Murphys, and her internal alarms were ringing softly. A few seats away, a man in a rumpled grey blazer nursed a lukewarm coffee. Robert Galloway was the kind of man who disappeared into a crowd. His face was unremarkable. His posture was relaxed, and his tired eyes suggested a long week of work. He was reading a paperback novel, but his senses were sharp, honed by years of observation. He noticed the Murphys' arrogance and the quiet dignity of the grandmother and her grandson. It was a familiar tableau, a clash of worlds he'd seen 1,000 times before. He took a slow sip of his coffee and turned a page, a silent observer in the gathering storm. When the boarding call for first class began, Gregory Murphy pushed forward with an air of divine right, elbowing past a young couple without a word of apology. Finally, he boomed to Patricia. "Let's get out of this zoo." Soon after boarding, for Zone 2 was announced. Avery, practically vibrating with excitement, carefully placed his Dreamliner model into his backpack. As he and Dorothy joined the line, a sudden surge from behind caused a man to stumble. He bumped into Avery, sending the boy's sketchbook flying. It skidded across the polished floor, landing open-paged at the feet of Gregory Murphy, who was standing just inside the jet bridge, barking at his wife about their carry-on luggage. Avery rushed forward. "Excuse me, sir. I'm so sorry." Gregory looked down, not at Avery, but at the open sketchbook. It was filled with breathtakingly detailed drawings of airplane schematics, cross-sections of jet engines, and complex aerodynamic equations. For a fleeting second, a flicker of surprise crossed his face, but it was immediately extinguished by his default setting scorn. He nudged the book with the toe of his gleaming Italian loafer. "Watch where you're going, boy," he sneered without a hint of understanding or kindness. Avery quickly scooped it up, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. Dorothy was right behind him. "It was an accident," she said, her voice calm but firm, her eyes locking with Gregory's. He said he was sorry. Gregory gave her a dismissive up-and-down glance that was meant to humiliate. He said nothing, simply turning his back on them and proceeding down the jet bridge, leaving a trail of cold arrogance in his wake. Robert Galloway, who had seen the whole exchange, felt a familiar knot tighten in his stomach. It was just a small moment, a tiny crack in the veneer of civilized travel, but he knew that small cracks often preceded major fractures. He zipped up his blazer, adjusted the heavy official-looking wallet in his breast pocket, and joined the line, his weary eyes now sharp with focus. The atmosphere inside the aircraft was a strange mix of anticipation and stale air. The flight attendants, led by a seasoned professional named Brenda Miles, moved through the aisles with practiced smiles, their calm demeanor a dam holding back the chaos of boarding. Avery and Dorothy found their seats 15B and 15C in the Economy Plus section. Avery, thrilled to have a window seat, immediately pressed his face to the thick acrylic, watching the ground crew move with the precision of a well-rehearsed ballet. For him, every moment of this journey was magic. Their seats were directly behind the last row of first class, and in that row, in seats 14A and 14B, sat Gregory and Patricia Murphy. Gregory was already complaining, his voice a low, insistent drill. "This is unacceptable, Patricia. The legroom is barely adequate. And what is this fabric? It feels like recycled burlap. For $5,000, I expect leather that has been personally massaged by Italian monks." Patricia murmured something placating, trying to disappear into her seat. Avery, in his excitement, was fidgeting. He reached into his backpack to pull out his sketchbook again, wanting to draw the specific model of tug that was pushing back a nearby plane. As he pulled the book out, his elbow inadvertently bumped the back of Gregory Murphy's seat. It was a light tap, barely noticeable. But to Gregory, it was a personal affront. He whipped his head around his face, a mask of theatrical fury. "Can you not?" He snapped, his voice slicing through the cabin's low hum. Several nearby passengers turned to look. Dorothy immediately put a hand on Avery's arm. "I'm so sorry, sir," she said, her tone polite but firm. "He's just excited." Gregory's eyes narrowed, zeroing in on Avery, who had frozen his hand still in his backpack. "Excited. This is a commercial aircraft, not a playground. Some of us are on this flight for important business, not for a charity trip." The words were laced with a venom that was unmistakable. Dorothy's back stiffened. "There's no need for that tone. He's a child." Gregory let out a short, derisive laugh. He leaned over the back of his seat, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial yet deliberately loud whisper that carried through the quiet cabin. "Let me give you some advice. If you can't afford to teach your children how to behave, then you shouldn't be in a premium cabin." Avery's face fell. The magic of the moment was draining away, replaced by a cold, creeping shame. He looked down at his slightly frayed sneakers and the simple backpack he'd had for 3 years. He suddenly felt small, out of place. Dorothy's voice was like ice. "Our tickets are paid for, sir. We have as much right to be here as you do." This was the final provocation for Gregory. His carefully constructed facade of superiority crumbled, revealing the raw ugliness beneath. He stood up slightly, turning to face them more directly, ensuring he had an audience. "A right," he scoffed, his voice rising in volume, dripping with condescension. He gestured vaguely at Avery, at his neat but simple clothes, at the wonder in his eyes that Gregory mistook for naivety. "Let's be honest. People like you don't belong here. You probably got this ticket from some handout or a lottery. You're too poor to fly." Silence. The words echoed in the enclosed space of the fuselage. It was as if the air had been sucked out of the cabin. The flight attendant, Brenda, who was helping a passenger a few rows back, froze. The couple across the aisle stared, their mouths agape. Patricia Murphy closed her eyes, her face a pale canvas of mortification. But the real impact was on Avery. The insult was a physical blow. His eyes, once so bright with the love of aviation, now glistened with unshed tears. The joy was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow hurt. He wasn't just a boy with a dream anymore. He was a problem, an eyesore, something that didn't belong. He slowly slid his sketchbook back into his bag and curled into his seat, trying to make himself as small as possible. Dorothy's heart broke. She wrapped her arm around her grandson, pulling him into a fierce hug. She turned to Gregory, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that decades of quiet grace had kept hidden. "You are a cruel, miserable man," she said, her voice trembling with rage, but still controlled. "And you should be ashamed of yourself." Gregory simply sneered, victorious. He had asserted his dominance, put the lower class in their place. He sat back down in his plush seat, adjusted his tie, and opened his financial newspaper. A king on his throne, oblivious to the fact that he had just committed an act of war in front of a federal officer. Across the aisle, in seat 12C, Robert Galloway carefully folded the corner of the page in his book, marking his spot. He placed the book in the seat-back pocket in front of him. He had heard every word. He had seen the boy's light extinguish. And in that moment, his leisurely trip to San Francisco for a routine inspection just became anything but routine. The quiet, unassuming passenger was gone. In his place was an investigator. The atmosphere in the front cabin was now thick with unspoken tension. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers a low hiss beneath the drone of the ventilation system. Gregory Murphy, seemingly proud of the scene he had caused, sat with an air of smug satisfaction, pointedly ignoring the ripples of discomfort he had created. The flight attendant, Brenda Miles, approached the row with a practiced neutral expression, but her eyes were tense. She had been with the airline for 15 years and had an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble. What she sensed now was a 5-alarm fire. "Is there a problem here, sir?" she asked, her voice, a model of professional calm directed at Gregory, but inclusive of everyone involved. Gregory didn't even bother to look up from his newspaper. "The problem is that this section of the cabin has become a daycare center. The problem is a lack of decorum. But don't worry, I've handled it." His dismissive tone was a direct challenge to her authority. Brenda's smile tightened. "Sir, our policy is to ensure all passengers feel comfortable and respected. If your son was bothering you," she said, turning to Dorothy with a softer tone, "I can see if there are other available seats. He is my grandson." Dorothy corrected her, her voice steady, despite the anger simmering beneath. And he was not bothering anyone. This man chose to insult a child. An insult? Gregory finally lowered his paper, feigning disbelief. "I was offering a piece of parental advice, a teachable moment." The sheer audacity of the lie was stunning. Before Brenda could formulate a response that wouldn't get her fired, a calm, level voice cut through the tension from across the aisle. "That's not what I heard." All heads turned to seat 12C. Robert Galloway was leaning forward slightly, his hands resting on his knees. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were fixed on Gregory Murphy with an unnerving intensity. Gregory sized him up with a quick, dismissive glance. The rumpled blazer, the inexpensive watch, the general air of a middle management nobody. This was not a man he needed to respect. "I'm sorry," Gregory said, with exaggerated politeness. "And you are a passenger," Rob replied simply. "One who heard you tell a 10-year-old child he was too poor to fly." "I don't believe that falls under the category of a teachable moment, unless the lesson is in cruelty." The directness of the statement sent a fresh shock wave through the nearby rows. Patricia Murphy sank even lower in her seat, her hand covering half her face as if to shield herself from the fallout. Gregory's face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He was not accustomed to being challenged, especially by someone he deemed so far beneath him. "Listen, buddy," he snarled, leaning into the aisle. "This is a private conversation. It has nothing to do with you. Why don't you go back to your little book and mind your own business?" Rob didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply held Gregory's enraged gaze. On an aircraft, so loud, aggressive, and abusive language ceases to be a private matter. It becomes a cabin issue. It becomes a crew issue. It can even become a safety issue. The flight attendant, Brenda, looked at Rob with a flicker of surprise and gratitude. He had just articulated the core of her training manual more succinctly than she ever could have in the heat of the moment. But Gregory was incensed. The challenge to his authority, the invocation of rules that he believed didn't apply to him, pushed him over the edge. "A safety issue," he barked out a laugh. A harsh, ugly sound. "Are you insane? I am the least of your safety issues. My company, Murphy Development, is in the final stages of a billion-dollar contract to expand the international terminal at SFO. I'm probably paying half this airline's bills with my corporate account. The only one in danger here is you, pal, if you don't shut your mouth." He had played his trump card. The name, the contract, the money, the holy trinity he used to bend the world to his will. He sat back, confident that this revelation would silence the man in the cheap blazer and put the flight attendant back in her place. He expected Rob to shrink back to stammer an apology. He expected Brenda to become instantly more deferential. He was wrong. Rob Galloway's expression didn't change, but a new light entered his eyes, a flicker of something cold and professional. He had hoped to de-escalate this as a fellow passenger. Gregory's tirade, his threats, and his boastful confession about the SFO contract had just changed the entire calculus of the situation. He had unwittingly provided the final piece of the puzzle. Rob nodded slowly as if processing this new information. Murthy development. The SFO terminal expansion. I see. He took a deep breath. Miss Miles, he said, his voice now carrying a new quiet authority that made the flight attendant stand a little straighter. You are the lead flight attendant on this aircraft, correct? Yes, I am. Brenda replied, confused by the sudden shift. You have a passenger exhibiting belligerent and abusive behavior towards another passenger, a minor, and is now being dismissive of your authority and creating a hostile cabin environment. Is that an accurate assessment from your perspective? Brenda hesitated for only a second before nodding. Yes, it is. Thank you, Rob said. He then turned his full attention back to the fuming Gregory Murthy. Sir, you asked me who I am. I believe it's time I answered that question. He reached into the breast pocket of his rumpled grey blazer. He didn't move quickly. His movements were deliberate, almost methodical. He pulled out a black leather wallet. It wasn't fancy, but it was thick and heavy. The air grew still. Every passenger in the surrounding seats seemed to be holding their breath, sensing that the dynamic of power was about to shift in a way no one could have predicted. The world seemed to slow down. The hum of the auxiliary power unit outside the soft ding of a seatbelt sign, being tested the rustle of a magazine, it all faded into a muffled background hum. All eyes were on the man in seat 12C and the black leather wallet in his hand. Gregory Murthy watched a smirk playing on his lips. He was expecting a business card, perhaps, from some mid-level manager at a rival company, or maybe even a lawyer looking for an ambulance to chase. This would be amusing. Rob didn't flip the wallet open with a dramatic flourish. He simply opened it as one might open a book and held it up. The wallet fell open to reveal two things. On one side was a photo ID with his unremarkable face under the bold header of the United States Department of Transportation. On the other side, nestled in a custom-cut recess, was a gleaming gold-colored badge. The eagle at the top seemed to stare directly at Gregory. The words engraved around the seal were crisp, clear, and utterly devastating. Federal Aviation Administration. Aviation. Safety Inspector. The smirk on Gregory Murthy's face did not just vanish. It was annihilated, collapsing into a slack-jawed mask of disbelief. The blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a pasty, sickly grey. His eyes, wide with panic, darted from the badge to Rob's face and back again, as if trying to reconcile the image of the man in the rumpled blazer with the immense, unimpeachable authority now displayed in his hand. Robert Galloway. Rob said, his voice still calm, but now it carried the weight of the entire federal government. FAA. My job is to ensure the safety and security of the national airspace system. That includes everything from the structural integrity of the wings to the conduct of the passengers in the cabin. A collective soft gasp rippled through the nearby seats. The passenger in 13C, who had been recording the incident on his phone, slowly lowered the device. The situation had escalated from a dramatic passenger dispute to a federal matter. Brenda Miles, the flight attendant, felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated shock, followed by an overwhelming wave of relief. An unannounced FAA inspector on a flight, a check ride, as it was known in the industry, was usually a source of anxiety for the crew. Today it was a godsend. She immediately understood the gravity of Rob Galloway's presence. He wasn't just a witness. He was the ultimate authority on this aircraft, second only to the captain. Rob let the silence hang for a moment, allowing the full weight of the situation to settle on Gregory Murphy. He continued his tone, shifting from that of a concerned passenger to that of an investigator, beginning an official inquiry. A few moments ago, you created a disturbance. You used abusive language towards a child. You were dismissive of a crew member's attempt to de-escalate. And you openly tried to use your professional standing and a pending business deal to intimidate people on this aircraft. In the language of my profession, you have exhibited behavior that is consistent with being a clear and present interference to the duties of a flight crew. He wasn't yelling. He didn't need to. Every word was a hammer blow dismantling Gregory's world brick by brick. Patricia Murphy finally broke her silence. "Gregory, please," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread. "Just apologize." But Gregory was trapped between his shattered arrogance and a rising tide of panic. "Apologize to these people, to this glorified hall monitor. This is a misunderstanding." Gregory stammered, his voice losing its baritone bluster, becoming thin and reedy. I was under a lot of stress. The deal, it's very high pressure." Rob's expression remained impassive. "Stress does not grant you a license to verbally assault a child or disrupt a flight, sir. In fact, your inability to manage your stress is in itself a potential safety concern." He then turned to Dorothy and Avery. His entire demeanor softened. The hard edge in his voice was gone, replaced by a gentle concern. "Ma'am, son," he said, his eyes meeting Avery's. "I am truly sorry for what you just experienced. No one deserves to be treated that way." Avery, who had been hiding his face in his grandmother's side, looked up. He saw the badge, and his eyes, red-rimmed but full of intelligence, widened in understanding. He knew what the FAA was. These were the people who wrote the rules for the machines he loved, the guardians of the sky. To see one of them defending him was like a superhero revealing his identity. Rob gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. "That's a nice model," he said, gesturing to the backpack where the Dreamliner was tucked away. "You have good taste." A tiny, hesitant smile touched Avery's lips, for the first time since the ordeal began. Returning his attention to the matter at hand, Rob closed his wallet with a soft snap that sounded like a gavel in the silent cabin. "Ms. Miles," he said to the flight attendant, "I'm going to need to have a word with the captain. In the meantime, please ensure the cockpit is aware that we have a potential Title 49 Section 46504 violation on our hands." Brenda's eyes widened. She knew the code. Interference with a flight crew, a federal offense. "Right away, Mr. Galloway," she said, her voice crisp and professional. She turned and walked swiftly toward the cockpit, her steps full of a purpose she hadn't had 5 minutes earlier. Gregory Murphy finally seemed to understand. This was not about an apology anymore. This was not something his money or his influence could fix. The quiet man in the grey blazer was not just a passenger, he was a gatekeeper, and Gregory had just tried to smash the gate down. He sank back into his seat, the financial newspaper lying forgotten on his lap. He looked out the window, but he wasn't seeing the baggage carts and fuel trucks. He was seeing his billion-dollar deal, his reputation and his future, all dissolving on the tarmac. The curtain separating the galley from the first-class cabin swished open, and Captain Miller emerged. He was a tall man with a calm, authoritative presence, his silver and black uniform immaculate. He didn't look flustered or angry, but his eyes, which had scanned 1,000 horizons, were focused and serious. Brenda had clearly and efficiently relayed the situation. He walked directly to row 12 and addressed Rob, his voice low and professional. "Inspector Galloway." "I'm Captain Miller. Brenda informed me of the situation. Can you give me your assessment?" Rob stood up and moved into the aisle to speak with him, creating a small zone of official privacy. Captain Rob began his voice, equally quiet. "We have a passenger, Mr. Murphy, in 14B, who has been verbally abusive to another passenger, a minor in 15C. The language used was derogatory and created a significant disturbance. When confronted by the lead flight attendant, he became belligerent and dismissive. He then attempted to leverage a significant business contract with SFO to intimidate those around him. In my professional opinion, his behavior is erratic, aggressive, and unpredictable. He constitutes a Level 1 threat with the potential to escalate. In aviation security, threat levels are clearly defined. A Level 1 threat involves disruptive, suspicious, or verbally abusive behavior. While it was the lowest level, the captain and crew were trained to take it with the utmost seriousness, as such behavior could easily escalate once airborne. Captain Miller listened intently, his expression unreadable. He glanced over at Gregory Murphy, who was now sitting rigidly in his seat, his face pale, avoiding all eye contact. He then looked at Avery, still nestled against his grandmother, and a flicker of deep disapproval crossed the captain's face. "I understand," Captain Miller said. He then walked the few steps to row 14. He stood in the aisle looking down at Gregory. He didn't speak immediately, letting the silence and the weight of his uniformed presence do the talking. "Mr. Murphy," he finally said, his voice devoid of warmth. "I am Captain Frank Miller. This is my aircraft. My primary and indeed my only responsibility is the safety and security of every single person on board. This includes the crew and all 256 passengers. Your behavior, as reported to me by my crew and corroborated by an FAA inspector, has called that safety into question." Gregory looked up, his eyes pleading. The bluster was gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked energy. "Captain, I assure you it's been blown completely out of proportion. I was having a bad day. I'm fine now. I won't say another word for the entire flight, I promise." "The time for promises has passed," Sir the Captain stated coolly. "The moment you chose to verbally assault a child and create a hostile environment, you forfeited the privilege of being on this flight. You have become a liability." Patricia let out a small, horrified gasp. "Captain, you can't be serious. We have to be in San Francisco. My husband has a vital meeting in the morning. It's career-defining." Captain Miller's gaze remained fixed on Gregory. "With all due respect, madame, your husband's career is not my concern. The safety of this flight is. The decision to remove a passenger is not one I take lightly, but I will not hesitate when I believe it is necessary. And I believe it is necessary now." He turned to Brenda. "Brenda, please inform the ground crew that we will be returning to the gate. Have airport security meet us there to escort 2 passengers off the aircraft." "Yes, Captain," she replied, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. The finality of the captain's words hit Gregory like a physical blow. "No, you can't do this," he cried, his voice cracking with desperation. "Do you know who I am?" "That SFO deal. I'll have your job. I'll have all of your jobs. I will sue this airline into oblivion." His frantic threats only served to seal his fate. The other passengers, who had been listening in stunned silence, now began to murmur their approval of the captain's decision. One passenger in row 16 muttered, "Good riddance," while the captain was dealing with Gregory. Rob Galloway knelt in the aisle next to Avery's seat. "Hey there, champ," he said softly. "You holding up okay?" Avery looked at him, his eyes still watery, and nodded mutely. "I saw your sketchbook earlier." Rob continued, his voice gentle. "The schematics were impressive, especially the cutaway of the GENX engine. You got the tertiary compressor stage just right." Avery's eyes widened in surprise. "You know about turbofan engines?" Rob smiled. "It's kind of my job. Before I was an inspector, I was an aeronautical engineer." He tapped the cover of Avery's sketchbook. "You have a real gift, son. Don't ever let anyone, and I mean anyone, make you feel like you don't belong exactly where you are. The sky belongs to people who love it, not people who can afford it. And you clearly love it." A single tear rolled down Avery's cheek, but this one wasn't from shame. It was from relief, from being seen and understood. He wiped it away and gave Rob a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, sir." Dorothy placed her hand on Rob's arm. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You have no idea what that means to him. To us." "Just doing my job, ma'am," he said, though his warm expression showed it was more than that. He was a regulator, yes, but he was also a decent human being who couldn't stand to see a bully win. The plane which had been taxiing began a slow, deliberate turn back towards the terminal. The message was clear. The journey for Gregory and Patricia Murphy was over. The taxi back to the gate was a slow, agonizing crawl, a funeral procession for Gregory Murphy's pride. For the other passengers, it was a few minutes of delay. For Gregory, it was a lifetime of humiliation, compressed into a single, excruciating journey. He could feel the change in the engine's pitch as the aircraft abandoned its path to the runway. The subtle shift in momentum, a physical manifestation of his reversed fortunes. He sat rigid, staring straight ahead, his mind a maelstrom of denial and fury. This wasn't happening. It was a bureaucratic fever dream. He was already composing the lawsuits in his head, envisioning the firings, the apologies, the groveling he would demand. He would own this airline. He would personally tear down Captain Miller's career and salt the earth where it stood. He would find that meddling, self-important inspector and have him auditing baggage carousels in Antarctica. This was a temporary setback, a ridiculous overreaction that he, Gregory Murphy, would rectify with overwhelming financial and legal force. But beneath the rage, a cold serpent of fear was beginning to uncoil in his gut. For the first time in decades, his power had failed him. His name, his money, his threats. They had all been met with an authority that was quieter, deeper, and infinitely more powerful than his own. Beside him, Patricia was no longer weeping. Her silence was somehow worse. She had shrunk away from him, pressing herself against the fuselage wall as if to physically distance herself from his toxicity. Her stillness was an accusation, a monument to his colossal failure of judgment. In her silence, he could hear every warning she had ever given him about his temper, his arrogance, his contempt for the world he believed was beneath him. The cabin around them was a theater of whispers. The blatant gawking had subsided, replaced by something more insidious. Furtive glances, hushed commentary, exchanged between seatmates, the glint of phone screens held at discreet angles. They were no longer just passengers. They were a jury, and they had reached a unanimous verdict. The soft final thud of the jet bridge connecting to the fuselage was the sound of the gavel falling. It was over. A moment later, the forward cabin door hissed open, and the bright, sterile light of the terminal flooded in. Silhouetted against it stood two Port Authority police officers, their broad shoulders filling the doorway. Their faces were professionally blank, their presence a calm but absolute statement of intent. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to enforce. Captain Miller's voice, impossibly calm, filled the cabin via the public address system. "Ladies and gentlemen, we do apologize for the slight delay. We had to return to the gate to resolve a customer service issue. We appreciate your patience and will be on our way as soon as possible." The phrase customer service issue was so exquisitely and deliberately bland that it was almost comical. It was the corporate equivalent of draping a silk cloth over a guillotine. The gate agent, a woman with tired eyes and a tense jaw, stepped aboard, her tablet clutched in her hand like a shield. She conferred for a moment with Brenda, and the captain then made her way to row 14. "Mr. and Mrs. Murphy," she said, her voice strained with forced politeness, "I'm going to have to ask you to gather your personal belongings and deplane with me." Patricia began moving at once, her hands trembling as she pulled her cashmere shawl from the overhead bin, desperate to flee. But Gregory remained motionless, a statue of defiance. So one of the police officers said, taking a half step forward. His voice was not threatening, but it carried an undeniable weight. "We need you to deplane now." Slowly, as if moving through deep water, Gregory unbuckled his seatbelt. He rose to his feet, his expensive suit feeling like a costume. He had to reassert control. It was all he knew. "This is an outrage." He began, his voice a low growl. "I am Gregory Murphy of Murphy Development. My lawyers are with Cromwell and Mooring. This action will result in the most significant lawsuit this airline has ever seen. You are making a catastrophic mistake." The gate agent didn't even blink. "Sir, your options right now are to walk off this aircraft on your own or to be escorted off. The choice is yours. But you will be deplaning." The finality in her voice, backed by the stoic presence of the officers, finally broke through his wall of bluster. He was beaten, defeated. With a strangled noise of pure frustration, he grabbed his briefcase from the floor. His walk down the aisle was the longest 10 yards of his life. It was a gauntlet of stairs. He saw it all in their faces, the open contempt of some, the pity of others, the cold indifference of most. He heard the barely concealed click of a phone's camera. Someone coughed to cover a laugh. The other passengers didn't part for him. He had to awkwardly squeeze past outstretched legs and elbows, his physical passage as obstructed as his professional one was about to be. As he passed row 15, he could not stop himself. He had to look. His eyes locked with Avery's. He had expected to see triumph, a child's gloating victory. But he saw nothing of the sort. Avery wasn't smiling. His young face was a complex canvas of emotions, the lingering shadow of the hurt Gregory had inflicted, confusion, and something else that twisted the knife deeper than any smirk could have a quiet, profound pity. In that moment, the boy he had tried to crush with the weight of his own importance was looking down on him from a moral high ground he could never hope to reach. It was the ultimate invalidation. Without another word, Gregory turned and stumbled the last few feet down the jet bridge, a fallen monarch exiled from his kingdom. Patricia followed her face hidden behind a curtain of hair, leaving behind the quiet humming cabin that was already healing from their presence. The moment the aircraft door closed, sealing them out, a palpable wave of relief washed over the passengers. The oppressive tension that had held them all captive finally dissipated. One man in business class began to applaud a slow, deliberate clap. Another joined in, then another. It wasn't a roar, but a soft, collective ripple of approval, a quiet affirmation that a necessary and just action had been taken. Captain Miller emerged once more from the cockpit, his face grim but resolute. He walked directly to Dorothy and Avery. Inspector Galloway, who had remained a silent, observant presence, gave the captain a nod of professional respect. "Ma'am, young man," the captain began, his voice filled with a sincerity that was absent from his official announcements. "On behalf of United Airlines and my entire crew, I want to offer you our deepest apologies. What you were forced to endure is unacceptable. It goes against everything we stand for. That behavior has no place on our aircraft or anywhere else in a decent society." "Thank you, Captain," Dorothy said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "We appreciate how you and your crew handled it." The captain's expression softened into a genuine smile. "Well, this unfortunate incident has resulted in 2 unexpected vacancies in our first-class cabin." He looked directly at Avery, whose eyes were still wide from the intensity of the last half hour. "I cannot think of anyone more deserving of a comfortable and peaceful flight to San Francisco. What do you say, young man? Would you like to see what it's like up front?" The question was like the sun breaking through the clouds. The last vestiges of Avery's sadness evaporated, replaced by a dazzling, unadulterated joy. He looked at his grandmother, his face alight with a silent, hopeful plea that needed no words. Dorothy laughed, a beautiful melodic sound of pure relief. "I think we would like that very much, Captain. Thank you." As they gathered their backpack and Dorothy's purse, Rob Galloway stood. He placed a gentle hand on Avery's shoulder. "Enjoy the flight," he said, his voice warm. "And good luck at the competition. Show them what you've got." "I will, sir." Avery promised, his voice ringing with a newfound confidence. Their walk to the front of the plane was the antithesis of Gregory's. The other first-class passengers who had witnessed the entire drama smiled warmly at them. There were quiet murmurs of welcome and, "So glad you're here." A woman in seat 2A reached out and patted Dorothy's arm as she passed. It was a small gesture, but it was a re-knitting of the social fabric Gregory had tried to tear apart. As they settled into the plush, spacious seats of 1A and 1B, the world transformed. A flight attendant immediately appeared, offering them pre-departure orange juice in heavy real glasses. Avery pressed his nose to the large, clean window, his own personal portal to the sky. He had been made to feel like an intruder, an outsider who didn't belong. Now he was being welcomed into the very heart of the world he loved, not because of money, but because of a shared decency. The plane finally pushed back from the gate for the second and final time. The powerful roar of the engines as they accelerated down the runway was no longer just a sound of propulsion. It was a sound of victory. As the aircraft lifted gracefully into the air, leaving the city, and the drama behind Avery opened his sketchbook to a fresh page. He wasn't drawing an airplane this time. With careful, reverent strokes, he began to sketch the profile of a quiet, unassuming man in a rumpled grey blazer, the guardian who had proved to him that even in the vast, impersonal sky, heroes were still flying. The flight to San Francisco was for Avery and Dorothy a journey into a different world. The quiet hum of the cabin in first class was a universe away from the cramped tension of the rows behind them. Here the air seemed calmer, the light softer. Dorothy watched as Avery ran his small hand over the supple leather of his seat. His eyes wide, with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. A flight attendant, not Brenda, but a colleague she had briefed, approached them with a warm, genuine smile. "Can I get you anything to start?" she asked. "A warm towel, some juice. The macadamia nuts are particularly good today." Avery, who had never been offered anything more than a small bag of pretzels on a plane, just stared speechless. Dorothy answered for them both. Her voice filled with a quiet gratitude that felt more at home in this rarefied air than Gregory Murphy's boorish demands ever could have. Later, Brenda Miles herself made her way up the aisle during a quiet moment in the flight. She knelt beside Avery's seat. "I just wanted to see how our VIPs are doing," she said softly. "And I wanted to thank you. You and your grandmother reminded us all why we do this job. It's not just about getting from A to B." She then looked at Avery, her expression serious but kind. "Don't let people like him dim your light. The world needs more people who look at the sky with wonder." The true highlight came an hour before landing. As promised, Captain Miller had the purser escort Avery to the front of the aircraft. Stepping through the cockpit door was like entering a shrine. The sprawling panorama of the deep blue sky, the endless carpet of clouds below, and the quiet, focused energy of the pilots was breathtaking. Captain Miller explained the functions of the primary flight display, the glowing arrays of buttons and switches speaking to Avery, not as a child, but as a fellow enthusiast. "This right here," the captain said, pointing to a screen, "is our flight management system. It's the brain. But the heart is the person who loves to fly." He smiled at Avery. "That's you. That's us." Standing there bathed in the glow of the controls, with the curvature of the earth visible on the horizon, Avery felt a profound sense of peace and purpose. He belonged here. This was his world. 3 days later, standing on a brightly lit stage in a San Francisco convention center, Avery accepted the first-place trophy for the National Youth Aerospace Challenge. His presentation on laminar flow wing design had dazzled the judges, a panel of engineers from NASA and Lockheed Martin. As the applause washed over him, he looked out into the crowd and saw his grandmother, her face a beautiful portrait of joy and pride, tears streaming down her cheeks. He had flown, and he had soared. For Gregory Murphy, the experience was precisely the opposite. His descent began the moment he was escorted into the sterile, beige-tiled Port Authority office at JFK. The polite but implacable officers took his statement, their expressions bored and procedural. His threats, his name dropping, his frantic explanations. They all dissolved against the cinder-block walls of bureaucratic indifference. He was just another unruly passenger, a file number, a problem to be processed. Patricia sat beside him. A silent, weeping statue of shame, her refusal to meet his gaze a more profound condemnation than any shouted accusation. His frantic attempts to salvage his meeting were a pathetic spectacle. Huddled in an overpriced airport hotel room, he conducted the most important video call of his life on a flickering laptop screen, his face washed out and haggard. The consortium of investors and city officials on the other end were a gallery of stoic, unimpressed faces. His rambling, high-pitched excuses about a security misunderstanding and an overzealous flight crew landed with a thud. They saw not a titan of industry, but a man unraveling a liability. The call ended with polite but chillingly final non-committals. The true death blow, however, came from Peter Schmidt, the journalist in seat 13C. He didn't sell his footage to the highest bidder. He was a veteran aviation reporter who saw a bigger story: the clash between the spirit of aviation and the arrogance of wealth. His article, published in the highly respected journal Aviation Forward, was a masterclass in narrative journalism. He detailed the entire incident with methodical precision, capturing the venom in Gregory's words and the quiet dignity of Dorothy and Avery. He wrote of the palpable sense of relief in the cabin when Gregory was removed, and he lauded the professionalism of the crew and the unexpected intervention of Inspector Galloway. He ended the piece with a poignant line: "Flight is a privilege built on trust and shared humanity. Mr. Murphy proved himself bankrupt in both." The article ricocheted through the corporate and aviation worlds. The board of the San Francisco International Airport convened an emergency session. The headline wasn't just bad press. It was a direct contradiction of their entire public image, which was built on safety, inclusivity, and service. The decision was unanimous and swift. The Murphy development contract was terminated. The public statement was a thinly veiled rebuke, citing the need for partners who align with our core values of respect, safety, and community. The market's reaction was a bloodbath. The SFO deal had been the single pillar holding up Murphy Development's inflated stock price. With that pillar kicked out, the entire structure collapsed. The stock didn't just dip, it cratered, losing 40% of its value in a single morning of trading. Gregory's phone rang incessantly. Furious investors, panicked board members, reporters hungry for a comment. The final call came from his own board of directors. It was short and brutal. He was informed that he had been removed as CEO and chairman effective immediately. A press release was already being distributed, citing a catastrophic loss of confidence in his leadership and personal judgment. Gregory Murphy, the man who believed his money made him a king, sat in the cavernous silence of his Park Avenue apartment, the television on mute, watching the red downward arrow next to his company's stock symbol. He had looked at a 10-year-old boy, full of dreams and brilliance, and had seen only poverty. He had sneered at a child's love for the sky, believing his own expensive ticket gave him ownership of it. In his all-consuming arrogance, he had failed to understand a fundamental law of aerodynamics, and life. For every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. By trying to viciously and publicly clip a child's wings, he had triggered the forces that resulted in his own spectacular, irreversible, and meteoric fall from grace. He was in every sense that mattered grounded. The story of Avery Evans and Gregory Murphy isn't just about a bully getting what he deserves. It's a powerful reminder that the true measure of a person isn't found in their bank account or their job title, but in how they treat those they perceive as having less power than themselves. Gregory Murphy believed his wealth put him above the rules of common decency. He was wrong. He forgot that in any crowd on any given day, you might be standing next to someone with the quiet authority to uphold those rules in the most spectacular way. Kindness costs nothing, but a lack of it can cost you everything. If you believe that karma has a way of balancing the scales, and that compassion should always have a seat on every flight, hit that like button to show your support. Share this story with others who need to hear that a good heart is more valuable than a first-class ticket. And be sure to subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories where justice takes center stage. What would you have done in that situation? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one.